I am happy to announce our guest tonight, John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Hello, Mr. Herbst.
Hi, good to see you.
It is good to see you indeed. Likewise. Well, President Zelensky, straightforward to the first question. President Zelensky announced a four-point plan for Ukraine's victory. Well, not so much that 4 points I'm particularly interested in, as we will be able to hear it sooner or later anyway. What my particular interest is, in one of these interviews of his, Zelensky said that all the points of Ukraine's victory plan, which he intends to present to US President Joe Biden, depend on Biden's decision, not Vladimir Putin. So do you think that after Kursk and after the recent successful attacks on oil refineries, Putin looks like very much out of the big game and barely anything depends on him? Might that be the case, do you think?
Look, Ukraine has had a very successful 2 months. The Kursk offensive, which you had people in Washington dismissing a month ago and expressing concern, has proved to be a great success. Ukraine has demonstrated it can hold on to that territory, and it seems to be defeating the expected Russian counteroffensive there. The Russian offensive at Pokrovsk seems to have stalled, and there are now reports that Russia has moved troops from the Pokrovsk front to Kursk, because Putin is embarrassed by the fact that Ukrainian forces have taken a portion of Russian territory and are occupying it successfully. And then, of course, you had this spectacular strike on this ammunition depot in the Tver Oblast earlier this week. And then, as you've mentioned, the ongoing exceptional strikes on Russian oil refinery capacity since March. Worth remembering that Jake Sullivan embarrassed himself by coming to Ukraine to tell Ukraine to stop it, and Zelensky told him no. So Ukraine has had a good run, but it's no question that Ukraine still greatly needs American support. In other words, we have to make sure we can renew our supplemental aid package sometime next year, although there's now talk about trying to get something done during the lame duck session after our election this year in Congress. And Biden needs to stop being intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. It looks really ridiculous that we still refuse to allow you to use the ATACMS, which, by the way, are not long-range missiles. They're only medium-range missiles against Russian targets in Russia, after Ukraine, one, has taken a chunk of Russian territory without Putin going nuclear. Two, again, destroyed the Russian ammo depot in the Tver Oblast without Putin going nuclear. And the United States is still intimidated. It's frankly bad policy, and I'm very embarrassed as an American citizen.
Well, I mean, thank you so very much for your embarrassment, if that can be said, put that way. But how can we translate it into Biden's stop being that intimidated? I mean, Putin was waving his nuclear gavel all over, Ukraine crossed all the red lines for the West already. So what is it exactly? Is it the games of politics, really? Or is that a real intimidation? Is that a real fear, Mr. Herbst?
Look, I know from personal contacts that they have used that to justify not providing things to you in the past. I've heard that from senior administration officials. You had the very strange performance by the deputy spokesman or woman at the Pentagon a couple of weeks ago, where she said the fact that we have not crossed any Russian red lines yet, despite their threats, does not mean they don't have them, which shows you the way that they are thinking. And, my understanding is that when Tony Blinken was heading to Kyiv last week, the Ukrainians were expecting, because they had heard from our side, that we were going to lift the prohibition on using ATACMS on Russian targets in Russia. And then that didn't happen. So his trip was also very embarrassing. And I think it's probably because Putin, again, upped the nuclear rhetoric. And so maybe Blinken thought he had the okay, and then they rethought it.
Okay, thank you so very much for this answer. I have a lot of questions in this part of our interview, but let's just pass to a different one, another one. Well, members of European...
By the way, actually, let me just mention one thing. This fear of escalation characterizes the Biden administration, not just in Europe, but even more in the Middle East. By this point in time, probably over 300 missile attacks have been launched on American soldiers in the greater Middle East. We barely responded. Um, and then they killed 3 of our soldiers. And then we responded, not nearly strongly enough, given the fact that American soldiers had died, but the way we should have responded when the first missile attacks happened. And there too, you hear the Biden administration saying we don't want escalation in the Middle East. So that timidity, which is not a good characteristic for a superpower, describes administration policy, again, not just in the Middle East, not just in Europe, in the Middle East, and also vis-a-vis China.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, the trying to avoid an escalation and trying to appease the monster you get, and the escalation is what you're going to get. This is quite obvious. It's
Right.
simple mathematics. So the members of the European Parliament have called on European Union countries to lift restrictions on the use of Western weapon systems against legitimate military targets in Russia. That much is clear. This is stated in a resolution supportive containing financial and military support for Ukraine. So the members believe that without lifting the current restrictions, Ukraine will not be able to fully exercise its right to self-defense. Oh my God. And will remain vulnerable to attacks on its population and infrastructure. Just a reality. So my question is, who else should we call? And who should we call for about this to make it finally obvious that we in Ukraine are literally sitting in the most mighty weapon on the world, sitting on it on the means of our survival and bringing back our sovereignty, and we cannot use it. Maybe do you know the means? What do we do?
Look, I think Zelensky's doing a pretty good job trying to make his case. But he's got a very hard sell given the timidity of senior levels in Washington and also in Berlin. I think at some point we will say yes to using our ATACMS on targets in Russia, and that's fine. I mean, I hope that'll happen. I think it will. I just don't know if it's going to be tomorrow or in 2026. Again, assuming a Biden-style policy after the coming presidential election. But point of fact, ATACMS are not a be-all and end-all. They're not a silver bullet. We should, in fact, be sending Ukraine not simply ATACMS. We should be sending Ukraine Tomahawks, which can go a couple of thousand miles and can strike deep into Russia the way that ATACMS cannot. And I suspect after ATACMS are provided, this will be the next thing we start to talk about. But because the United States has not attacked this issue, has not addressed Russia's war in Ukraine by saying, all right, this is something we absolutely must stop. Putin must lose. Ukraine must win. And what can we do to help Ukraine win? If they did that, they would be strategizing with your leadership about your plans for the war and providing you with the necessary advanced weapons, and not just ATACMS, again, Tomahawks and other things that we have, which are perfectly legitimate for you to receive from us to stop an aggressor committing massive war crimes bordering on genocide.
Absolutely.
And an aggressor that identifies the United States as its principal adversary. So they're coming for us too.
For last century or so, yeah. Because Russia is Soviet, isn't it? Let's be straightforward about it. Russia is just higher. I mean, it is a Soviet Union still, but some of.
Well, I would say I would put it slightly differently. Putin reflects the authoritarian tendencies we've seen in Russian history, which were especially great during the Soviet period, but which predate that.
Mr. Herbst, I'm looking at what we in Ukraine do with drones and just did with them. So I mean that Russian depot that probably is still burning as we speak. And it makes me wonder, well, just a provocative question. Say tomorrow Ukraine has its own missile capable of breaching Moscow, and the Kremlin is on fire just as this depot. Do you think the West will be still intimidating and in general will rather take that as a legit act of war, as an escalation and blah, blah, blah?
If I would not, one, I hope Ukraine has that missile ready for use soon, the one that Zelensky talked about. And I think certainly Ukraine should use it on not just military, but strategic targets in Russia, which includes some transportation systems, it includes some economic targets. I would strongly recommend that Ukraine not use weapons designed to hit the Kremlin, or strictly speaking, civilian areas, residential areas in Russia. That would be a serious mistake in my judgment. But anything else is fair game. And it would be hard for the United States to do anything more than wring its hands as Russia did that, as Ukraine did that. just as we did with the oil refineries.
Right. I meant Moscow, I meant the Kremlin, of course, just more as a symbol, not as an actual legitimate target.
Right.
But thank you so very much. And I hope to talk to you soon in this very studio. Again, it was a
Yeah.
pleasure.
Same. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. John Herbst was with us, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, senior director of the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. And we say thank you to him.